He didn't just abandon his wife. He did it in the very same penthouse where he thought he became untouchable. Mark Dalton was 36 years old the night he publicly discarded his wife of 8 years. Emily Clark, 33. Quiet, steady, and far more powerful than he ever realized. It was Thursday night at 9:13 p.m. in a penthouse boardroom overlooking downtown Dallas, just 4 minutes after he signed the biggest contract of his life, a $40 million acquisition deal for his company, Dalton Modular Systems. He believed it would catapult him into a new elite world. He didn't know the woman standing behind him wasn't just his wife. He didn't know she wasn't powerless. He didn't know she wasn't done. In front of executives, assistants, and the mistress he planned to marry, Mark raised his champagne and announced, "Tonight marks my new beginning." Emily was a placeholder. Laughter flickered around the table. Cameras clicked. Tessa, 29. Polished hair, polished smile, polished lies, squeezed his arm as she told Emily she should move out by the weekend. If you'd been in that room, you would have seen the way Emily blinked once, slowly, as if absorbing not just humiliation but information. And you would have missed the smallest detail on the contract Mark bragged about. The parent company name at the top, ED Holdings Group, LLC, her initials, her inheritance, her power. To Mark, ED Holdings was just the anonymous parent behind Northlake Crest Capital, the investment firm whose logo was printed all over the deal documents. He let the buyer's lawyers handle the paperwork and never read past the payout numbers. Hours later, at 11:30 p.m., Mark sent Emily away from the $2.8 million Highland Park house they lived in, tossed her a $2,000 check on the driveway, and changed the security code from his phone. He thought the house was his. He thought the new salary, $680,000 a year, as an executive at the acquiring company, would make him unreachable. He thought the world finally belonged to him. But what Mark didn't know was this. The woman he humiliated, the woman he stripped of her home, the woman he mocked in front of his mistress, was the hidden majority owner of the holding company that had just bought his business. Years earlier, her father's estate had placed 71% of ED Holdings under a private vehicle. She controlled Northlake Crest LLC, while Mark was still bragging that paperwork is for lawyers. He never bothered to read a single clause. And the signature he was celebrating, the one he bragged about, the one he believed would change everything, it triggered a mandatory 90-day ethics and compliance audit under Section 14C, a clause she had quietly approved as majority owner the year before. An audit whose scope she could widen. An audit that would uncover his mistress, his insider transfers to her business, his plan to ditch the old life, and every lie he'd polished into a persona. The very next week, when Mark walked into what he thought was a routine executive meeting, confidently adjusting his $22,000 watch, he didn't know Emily was waiting behind tinted boardroom glass. The same wife he abandoned, the same wife he underestimated, the same wife who effectively owned the chair he would soon be fired by. This isn't just a story about a marriage ending. It's about what happens when a man bets everything on his ego against a woman who was holding the real power all along. Tell me where you're watching from. Your presence means everything. It started the way most betrayals do, with something small, something so insignificant that most people would have brushed it off. Emily Clark, 33, quiet co-owner of a sprawling family holding company and Mark's wife of 8 years, had built a life that looked steady from the outside. A Highland Park home, a paid-off SUV, a calendar full of charity events, and family office board calls that no one knew she actually led. She preferred it that way, power in the background, not the spotlight. On their tax returns and casual conversations, she was just helping with her dad's old business. Mark Dalton, 36, founder of Dalton Modular Systems and a man who wore ambition like a second skin, had once fit perfectly into that quiet world. For years, they'd scraped by while he built his company. She'd done the books at their kitchen table, taken late-night calls with his vendors, and used her anonymous connections through Northlake Crest to introduce him to investors he thought he'd found at networking events. Then the little changes started. It was the late-night strategy dinners that appeared on his shared calendar 3 Tuesdays in a row, always blocked off from 7:30 p.m. to 11 p.m., always labeled Meridian Prep, Project Meridian, being the code name for the potential acquisition she, as a board member, already knew existed, but not that her own husband's company was the target. It was the new cologne that lingered on his shirts, expensive, sharp, something she hadn't bought. It was the way he stopped asking her to skim his pitch decks and started telling her, "It's technical, you wouldn't get it," even though numbers had always been their language. If you'd been in their kitchen on those nights, you would have seen Emily rinsing dishes while her phone lit up with bank notifications. Restaurant charges for two, bar tabs that climbed past $300, rideshare receipts from uptown at 112 a.m. She told herself it was networking, deals, the hustle he'd always promised would pay off. One afternoon, while scheduling her own quiet board meetings under the vague label Foundation Call, she glanced at his shared calendar and saw an event title that snagged her, Meridian Dinner, +1 TBA. When she asked, he barely looked up from his laptop. "It's just a thing with the acquiring team," he said. "Long, boring, all numbers. You'd hate it." He had never told her she'd hate a numbers meeting before. That was their language, their thing. The first real crack appeared 2 weeks later, on a rainy Monday, when she noticed a notification on their joint card, a $9,000 charge from a luxury boutique in Uptown. When she texted him, he replied an hour later. "Client gift. Chill." She tried. She really did. But the unease grew. He became sharper with her, softer on his phone. He stopped wearing his old navy blazer and started talking about upgrading everything once Meridian lands. Then there was the night she overheard him in his home office, door half closed, saying, "Once this thing hits, I'm done pretending. I'm not going to be dragged down by someone who thinks too small." He never said her name. He didn't have to. She knew. Still, she stayed silent, watched, took note. Paper remembers what people forget, her father had always said. She memorized patterns, numbers, dates, and then came the Thursday night that changed everything. 3 weeks after that client gift and those late-night calls, Mark asked her to come to a small signing dinner in downtown Dallas. Like it was an afterthought. "It'll be quick," he said. "Smile, shake hands, then we'll celebrate." She didn't know yet that the celebration wasn't for them. She didn't know yet that he planned to trade her in the same room where he'd sign his big win. She didn't know yet that the deal he worshipped was actually hers. That truth would arrive later, like a quiet blade. For now, it was just Thursday night in Dallas, and she was walking into a glass-walled boardroom where her marriage was about to be publicly reduced to a punchline. It was Thursday night in downtown Dallas, and the penthouse boardroom on the 39th floor glowed like a glass jewel above the city. The skyline stretched out in every direction, neon and glass, and money, the kind of view people liked to point at when they said, "We made it." Around the long walnut table, executives in tailored jackets lifted champagne flutes, the words 40 million floating in the air like confetti no one had to sweep. Mark stood at the head of the table in that too bright navy suit that screamed new money and borrowed confidence. Emily sat near the far end, half in shadow, in a simple black sheath dress with a scuffed leather tote at her feet, as if she'd wandered into someone else's celebration and decided to stay quiet so no one would notice. If you'd been in that room, you'd probably have assumed she was an assistant who'd stayed late to take notes. Most people there did. They were wrong. At Mark's right hand, almost fused to his side, was Tessa Monroe, 29, his new strategic marketing director, with flawless waves of blonde hair and a diamond tennis bracelet so new it still looked stiff on her wrist. Officially, she was a contractor. Unofficially, everyone in that room with half a brain could see she was something else. "Ladies and gentlemen," Mark announced, tapping his crystal flute with the back of his knuckle, the $22,000 gold watch on his wrist catching the overhead lights. "This is it. Project Meridian is officially in the bag. $40 million. He let the number hang there, savoring it. And honestly, it's just the beginning. Soft claps, murmurs of approval, the shuffling of papers. At the far side of the table sat Harold King, 58, the silver-haired CEO face of Northlake Crest Capital, the acquisition arm of ED Holdings Group LLC. He smiled the practiced smile of a man who'd watched 100 younger egos rise and fall in these very rooms. The contract lay open in front of Mark, pages neatly stacked. The heading on the first page read, "Project Meridian, Purchase Agreement, $40 million buyer, Northlake Crest Capital, a portfolio company of ED Holdings Group, LLC, seller, Dalton Modular Systems, Incorporated." Beneath it, in smaller print, was a parent company line nobody but Emily seemed to be looking at. Ultimate Parent, ED, Holdings Group, LLC. Emily's gaze lingered on those letters for half a second longer than it should have. Her fingers drifted up to the thin silver pendant at her throat, the one her father had given her when she joined the board, the same year they hid her ownership behind North Lake Crest for privacy. Beneath the table, she curled her toes in her heels to keep herself grounded. "So before I sign away my blood, sweat, and tears," Mark said, grinning wide, "I want to thank the people who got me here." He turned, sweeping the room with his eyes. For a moment, Emily actually thought he might nod in her direction, acknowledge the years she'd spent running his spreadsheets at midnight, hunting for errors before investors saw them, quietly calling in favors from contacts he didn't even know she had. Instead, his gaze slid right past her and landed on Tessa. "First and foremost," he said, "this woman right here. Tessa came in when our brand was, let's be honest, stale. She believed in the vision. Pushed me." Tessa's smile flickered with rehearsed humility. "Oh, stop," she said, but didn't move her hand from his arm. "And, of course," Mark added, almost as an afterthought, "my wife Emily, who held down the fort while I chased the big stuff." His eyes finally found her, and there was a sharpness there, an edge most of the room missed. "Placeholders matter too." A couple of people laughed, unsure if they were supposed to. Heat crawled up Emily's neck. Placeholder. The word lodged in her chest like a splinter. If you'd been sitting in her chair, the storyteller might say, you would have felt how heavy that tiny word really was. Emily managed a thin smile, but her grip tightened around the stem of her glass. She watched Mark lean into Tessa, smelling the perfume Emily had seen only once before in a Sephora bag tossed on the passenger seat of his car. Harold cleared his throat. "Well, Mark, if you're done with the speeches, we should get signatures before the champagne goes to our heads." Mark laughed. "Fair point." He dropped into his chair, took the pen handed to him, and signed with a flourish on the signature line, "Mark Dalton, Chief Executive Officer, Dalton Modular Systems." Emily watched the ink sink into the paper, dark and final. "Congratulations," Harold said, signing his own line as representative for North Lake Crest Capital. "Once the funds clear, your payout will be..." He glanced at the summary sheet. "Just shy of $40 million before taxes and transaction fees." Mark whistled. "Not bad for a kid from Garland with no degree, huh?" He stood again and raised his champagne flute, soaking in the attention. "Tonight marks my new beginning," he announced. Emily was a placeholder. Laughter flickered around the table. Cameras clicked. Heat crawled up Emily's neck, hotter than before. He looked down the table to where Emily sat, expression composed. "Guess we finally get to upgrade, huh, Em?" "Upgrade?" she repeated quietly. Flashback, small home office, suburban Dallas, 2008. Emily was 17, knees pulled up under an old oak desk in her father's cramped home office. Peter Clark, 52 at the time, owner of a small but growing logistics firm, wore the same tired button-down he'd worn all week, ink stains on the cuff. He slid a thin file toward her. "See this?" he said. "This contract says they're buying 5 trucks. But down here," he tapped a tiny line in the middle of the page, "this clause says if they damage them and try to walk away, they still pay full price." "Isn't that sneaky?" Emily had asked, frowning. Her father smiled. "No, it's protection. People forget what they promise when it stops suiting them. Paper remembers what people forget, Em. Always sign as the owner, never just as the face." His hand had closed around hers, guiding her pen to the signature line of a mock contract he drafted for her, like it was a game. The memory dissolved. It was Thursday night in Dallas again, and Mark was pushing the signed agreement toward Harold like he'd just won the lottery. "Congratulations," Harold said, signing his own line as representative for North Lake Crest Capital. "Once the funds clear, your payout will be..." He glanced at the summary sheet. "Just shy of $40 million before taxes and transaction fees." Mark whistled. "Not bad for a kid from Garland with no degree, huh?" He looked down the table to where Emily sat, expression composed. "Guess we finally get to upgrade, huh, Em?" "Upgrade?" she repeated quietly. "Our lives," Mark said, voice suddenly too light. "Different neighborhood. Different everything." His eyes flicked to Tessa, who didn't bother to hide her grin. "Actually," Tessa chimed in, swirling the champagne in her glass, "we were talking about timelines, Mark. If you're moving into the new condo in Uptown by, What, the end of May? It might make sense for other arrangements to be made sooner. The word arrangements hung there, heavy and slippery. Emily's stomach dropped. Arrangements, she said slowly. Like what? Mark exhaled, performing exasperation for the room. Emily, can we not do this here? Do what? She asked, though she already knew. Look, he said, straightening his tie. Things have been off for a while. You know that. I didn't want tonight to turn into a scene, but this deal, this money, it changes everything. I'm moving forward. Tessa and I are together, officially. The room went unnaturally quiet. Someone coughed. The air conditioning hummed too loudly. Mark went on, as if reading from a script he'd rehearsed. We'll make sure you're taken care of. I'll talk to my lawyer about a fair settlement. But I can't keep pretending this marriage is working just because it's convenient. Convenient. Placeholder. The words piled on top of each other like bricks. For a second, Emily couldn't feel her hands. She stared at the pages of the contract, at the small print near the top, E.D. Holdings Group, LLC, Ultimate Parent. Her thumb rolled over the edge of her pendant. The initial shock that had threatened to swallow her started to cool, like water being poured over hot metal. Hurt gave way to a thin, sharp strand of anger, and beneath that, something even more dangerous. Clarity. If you'd been close enough to see her eyes, the storyteller might say, you'd have realized that something behind them had just clicked. Of course, Emily said, voice steady now. I wouldn't want to cause a scene. Tessa shifted, surprised by the lack of drama. We just want what's best for everyone, she added, in that soft script people use when they've already decided what best means, and it doesn't include you. Harold cleared his throat again, trying to reset the mood. Well, that's personal business. Professionally, Northlake Crest is thrilled. A server stepped in with a tray of fresh champagne. Mark's phone buzzed on the table, screen lighting up. He didn't look at it at first, too caught up in the congratulations and backslaps from the executives circling him. Emily did. For a brief second, she saw the preview line on the lock screen. New message, E.D. Holdings Compliance, Section 14, C initiated. Her initials were right there, buried in the sender address, ed.leadership@northlake-crest.com. No one but her would ever notice it. Mark finally picked up the phone and glanced at the notification, dismissing it with a flick of his thumb. Corporate spam, he muttered, dropping the device back onto the table. He had no idea that the email he just ignored contained a formal confirmation. The moment he'd signed the Meridian contract, he'd automatically triggered a 90-day compliance and ethics audit under Section 14C, an audit overseen by policy by ED Holdings majority owner, Emily. She took a slow sip of champagne, the bubbles sharp against her tongue, and let herself breathe. What Mark didn't know yet was that tonight wasn't just the end of their marriage. It was the beginning of an investigation that would take apart everything he thought he'd just won, line by line, clause by clause. It was still Thursday night in Dallas, just past 11:30 p.m., when Emily stepped out of the rideshare and saw her own suitcase waiting for her on the edge of the driveway like a discarded package. The Highland Park street was quiet, the kind of silence that made humiliation echo louder. Warm porch lights glowed across the manicured lawn, and through the open garage, she could see a sleek silver Audi Q5 that didn't belong to her Tessa's car already parked in the spot Emily had used for 8 years. If you'd been standing on that driveway, you would have felt the truth hit long before the words did. She wasn't welcome here tonight. Mark came out onto the front porch, sleeves rolled up, tie loosened as if he'd just finished a long day instead of a long betrayal. Good, he said when he saw her. You're back. Let's make this quick. His voice carried that sharp managerial tone he used in staff meetings, efficient, rehearsed, detached. Tessa followed a step behind him, swinging a $9,000 Saint Laurent handbag Emily recognized from their joint credit card bill just 2 weeks earlier. She leaned casually against the railing, smiling like this was entertainment. She reached over and squeezed his arm. We talked about this, Tessa said lightly. It's better for everyone if you can. Move out by the weekend, Emily. Mark exhaled heavily. Look, Em, you know I didn't want to do this like some dramatic breakup scene. But after everything tonight, it's better we rip the Band-Aid off. Emily felt the sting before she felt her feet. Rip the Band-Aid off, she repeated softly. He stepped down toward her. You've been holding me back for years, Em, playing small, being scared of growth. I'm finally moving up. This deal puts me at a projected $680,000 annual salary next year. I need a partner who gets that, who matches that energy. He gestured lazily toward Tessa. She does. Tessa didn't even blush. Emily's stomach tightened, but the shock from the boardroom had worn down into something heavier, deeper. So this is it? Mark nodded, already impatient, as if he were closing out a meeting. I changed the security code. You won't be able to get in after tonight. I'll have your remaining clothes boxed up. You can pick them up tomorrow if you text first. What he didn't say, because he hadn't read the trust documents, was that the alarm system and the deed weren't actually in his name. He pulled an envelope from his jacket and held it out like a bribe in the middle of a negotiation. Here, $2,000. Just so you can get a hotel or something while we sort out next steps. I'm not heartless. The absurdity of the number nearly made her laugh, not outwardly, but somewhere inside, where the hurt was beginning to cool into clarity. He thought $2,000 would buy her silence, her cooperation, her grace. She took it without a word. Not because she needed it, but because every piece of paper in this story would matter. A man in his early 50s approached from the side of the house, cap in hand. Miss Clark? He asked gently. I'm sorry about all this. Emily blinked, surprised to be addressed with her own name for the first time tonight. Mr. Alvarez, she said, recognizing the property manager. You didn't have to come out this late. He hesitated, gaze flicking nervously toward Mark. I just wanted to clarify something before things get complicated. He lowered his voice. Mr. Dalton called me earlier from the boardroom. Wanted to confirm ownership before making changes. Mark folded his arms. Yeah, and you told me it's mine. I make the payments. Alvarez swallowed. The mortgage payments go through Harbor Crest Trust, sir. When I pulled the file, the deed showed the trust as owner, sole beneficiary, Emily Clark. He glanced at her again. You already know that, ma'am. But I thought it was fair to say it out loud. A flicker, just a tiny one, ran across Mark's face. Annoyance, confusion, calculations rearranging themselves behind his eyes. But he masked it quickly. Whatever. It's marital property. We'll let the lawyers fight over the fine print. Alvarez shook his head, uncomfortable. I'm just telling you what the record says. I don't get involved in anything else. Tessa's smile wavered. Just a hair. But Emily caught it. Flashback, Dallas law office. 2019. Emily sat across from her father's attorney, Diane Porter, 61, a sharp woman with horn-rimmed glasses and a voice that could cut through steel. A stack of papers sat between them, thick enough to anchor a ship. These are asset protections, Diane explained. Your father insisted on this structure. If you ever marry, divorce, separate, fall out with someone, no one gets their hands on your inheritance unless you explicitly allow it. Harbor Crest Trust holds the house. You remain the sole beneficiary. Emily had frowned. Mark won't care about this. He loves me. Diane had exhaled softly, not unkind. Maybe he does. But love isn't what I'm drafting against, Emily. I'm drafting against what people become when money is involved. The memory dissolved. The driveway lights reflected off her silver pendant, making it glint like a small warning flare. Mark waved a dismissive hand. Whatever the paperwork says, you can't stay here tonight. This is my fresh start, Em. I don't need drama. Legally, she could have walked right past him, into the house that was held in a trust for her alone. But it was nearly midnight. She was exhausted, blindsided, and alone with a man whose anger was starting to outweigh his charm. She inhaled slowly, letting the night air fill her lungs, letting the last threads of humiliation settle into resolve. Okay, she said quietly. I'll go for tonight. Mark seemed almost relieved by how easy it was. Good, this is better for everyone. Tessa linked her arm with his. We're just moving forward. That's all. Some people evolve. Emily held her gaze. Some do. She bent down, reached for her suitcase handle, and pulled it upright. The wheels clicked softly against the concrete, small, steady sounds that didn't match the earthquake happening beneath her calm exterior. Her phone buzzed in her coat pocket as she walked toward the curb. She almost didn't check it, expecting a bank alert or a spam email. But the sender made her breath catch. Nora Bennett. The message was only 5 words. It's time. We implement Section 14C tomorrow. Nora wasn't just her lawyer. Nora's firm represented E.D. Holdings Group on high-level governance. Emily looked back at the house at the porch where Mark stood with his arm around another woman, and something inside her settled into place like a locked gear. Tonight wasn't the end of anything. It was the beginning. She stepped into another rideshare. This time the pin dropped not on a hotel, on a law firm. It was Friday morning in downtown Dallas, just after 8:15 a.m., when Emily stepped into the gleaming marble lobby of Wilcox and Arden, the law offices that handled both her family's holdings and, officially, certain governance matters for E.D. Holdings Group. The city outside buzzed with early commuters and espresso lines, but inside the building, everything felt too quiet, too cold, like the air conditioning had been set to match the mood of corporate risk assessment. If you'd been there, watching her walk through the glass doors with the same suitcase she dragged off her own driveway, you might have mistaken her for someone defeated. Most people would have. They would have been wrong. Nora Bennett, 44, Emily's attorney and a woman with sharp auburn hair and a reputation for dismantling unethical executives, waved her in from the doorway of a private conference room. She wore a charcoal blazer that fit like armor. "Rough night?" she asked quietly, though she already knew the answer. Emily nodded once. Nora didn't press. She simply gestured toward the long table covered in digital tablets, printed contracts, and confidentiality folders. A man sat waiting at the far end, Evan Marshall, 38, the corporate compliance officer assigned to the Project Meridian transition. He had the clean, neutral look of someone who'd spent years reading other people's secrets without reacting to them. "Emily," Nora said, taking her seat, "Evan will walk us through the requirements triggered by Section 14C. You remember the clause?" Emily did. She'd approved the latest revision herself, but she let Nora explain, because hearing it out loud was a kind of power in itself. Nora tapped the contract packet on the table. Section 14C is a behavioral compliance clause in E.D. Holdings' standard acquisition documents. For any deal over $10 million, it requires a full audit of key executives at the acquired company. By policy, that audit runs on a 90-day window. She glanced at Emily. Meridian is $40 million, so the clause triggers automatically. She slid a summary sheet toward Emily. Any behavior that could damage the company's reputation, workplace harassment, misuse of funds, sexual misconduct, public scandal qualifies for penalties. Those penalties include forfeiture of signing bonuses, clawback of certain payouts, and in extreme cases, removal from the acquiring company's leadership track. Emily's eyes skimmed the page. Her initials were at the bottom of the revision note. E.C. Board Majority Sign-Off. July 2023. Flashback Wilcox and Arden Office. July 2023. Emily sat across from Nora in a smaller conference room, sipping lukewarm tea. Mark had been coming home late for months, brushing off questions with vague references to networking dinners. He'd stopped bringing Emily to events. Stopped asking her opinion on deals he once begged her to look over. Nora placed a draft clause in front of her. "You don't have to assume the worst," she'd said gently. "But you do need to protect the company and yourself. If any executive tied to you personally goes off the rails, Section 14C gives the board leverage. Quiet leverage." Emily had traced her initials onto the approval line, hands trembling slightly. "Paper remembers what people forget," she'd whispered, her father's words echoing back to her. She hadn't told Nora exactly how worried she was about Mark. She didn't have to. Nora had seen enough marriages to read the subtext. The memory dissolved, the present sharpened. Nora folded her hands. And now Section 14C is active. Emily exhaled slowly, a controlled and steadying breath. "So, we begin the audit." Evan nodded. "With your authorization as majority owner of E.D. Holdings." "Yes." "My team started the automated sweep last night, as soon as his signature hit the system. Today we move into manual review." He tapped his tablet. "We'll review emails, corporate cards, travel receipts, calendar logs. Anything that indicates reputational risk. Billing is $650 an hour, but the board pre-approved up to 80 hours for the initial sweep." Emily's eyes flickered to the tablet. "Where do we start?" Evan swiped to a folder labeled Dalton, Preliminary Review. "Before you arrived, we ran the first reconciliation of his corporate credit card. Something stood out." He turned the screen toward them. A single entry glowed red. The Henley Hotel, executive suite, $4,900. Guest, Tessa Monroe. The room seemed to tighten around the three of them. Emily felt the familiar sting behind her ribs, the echo of betrayal, but this time, it didn't consume her. It focused her, like a lens turning, narrowing. Nora's expression didn't change, but her voice grew quieter, sharper. This alone triggers reputational risk under 14C, but it's only the beginning. Evan nodded. Correct. That was just what the automated rules caught in minutes. The deeper manual review is underway now. Emily studied the red highlighted line. She had seen betrayal already, lived it in the driveway last night. But here, on a digital ledger, it wasn't emotional, it was evidence. It was leverage. It was a path. Her fingers brushed the pendant again, grounding herself. Hurt receded, replaced by something colder and infinitely steadier. Keep going, she said. Dig into everything. Evan gave a single, confirming nod. We will. I'll send you updates as new flags come in. Officially, you're just receiving board oversight reports. Unofficially, he hesitated. You're the one who decides how far this goes. A silence settled over the room, heavy, electric, the kind that forms right before a storm breaks. Then Evan's tablet buzzed. Once, then again, a third time. He frowned. That's fast, he murmured, opening the notification. His brows lifted slightly. We've got new flags from his internal messaging threads and travel accounts. Nora leaned forward. What kind of flags? Evan hesitated, eyes scanning the screen. This might be more serious than the hotel charge. He turned the tablet but didn't explain yet. Emily saw only a preview line, just enough to know that whatever they had found, it wasn't small. It wasn't singular. It was a pattern. A pattern he didn't know she had access to. The cold clarity inside her solidified. Show me everything, she said. Evan nodded once. We will. But Emily, what we're uncovering, this goes deeper than you think. And with that, the screen refreshed, loading more flagged entries, more red lines, more names, more dates. What they didn't know yet was that while the audit team was pulling receipts and messages, the Mistress was out in Dallas, unknowingly adding fuel to the fire. It was still Friday in Dallas, the kind of warm spring afternoon where uptown storefronts glimmered like curated jewelry cases. At 3:40 p.m., inside the Belvedere Luxe Salon, a place where a blowout cost more than most people's monthly car payment, Tessa Monroe lounged in a black leather styling chair with foils in her hair and a glass of champagne balanced between her manicured fingers. If you'd been in that room, you would have seen the way other clients glanced at her, the kind of envy reserved for people who looked like their lives always tilted upward. Most of them would have assumed she'd truly won. They were wrong. Across from her, Chloe Hart, 31, Tessa's closest friend and a social media consultant who lived for gossip, angled her phone just right to catch the salon's mirrored glow. The lighting in here is nuts, Chloe murmured, already filming. Say something about your big week. Tessa smirked, leaning closer to the mirror as a stylist teased out the ends of her hair. Well, she purred. When your man closes a $40 million deal, you don't really have a small week, do you? She raised her champagne flute like a toast to herself. Mark says once the transition wraps, I'll basically be co-owner by association. He's already talking rings, Tessa added, smirking at her own reflection. Says, we'll make it official as soon as the divorce papers are filed, Chloe snorted. Emily must be losing her mind. Oh, please. Tessa rolled her eyes, flipping her foils back dramatically. Emily was the practice wife. Everyone knows it. The stepping stone. You don't build generational wealth with someone who shops at outlet malls. Chloe laughed a little too loudly, and the stylist paused, uncertain, but Tessa waved her off. Keep working, keep listening. If you'd been standing near the reception desk, you would have seen how quickly this kind of talk spread. Wealthy salons were like confessional booths wrapped in glass. Everyone could hear, no one pretended they couldn't. The stylist set down her comb. So, you're moving in with Mark? She asked. Careful, curious. Tessa beamed. Already halfway there. He got me into a 2022 BMW X4 white with camel interior. Lease is like $1,150 a month, but he said it doesn't matter anymore. He's basically rich now. She flicked her wrist, making her bracelet catch the light. His signing bonus alone will be 8 figures. Chloe panned the camera toward her. Say it again. For the real. Tessa leaned in, eyes narrowing with cruel delight. Emily was the practice wife. Chloe cracked up, hitting the stop button. Oh my God, that's going to kill online. And it did. Within minutes, Chloe uploaded a trimmed clip just enough to imply insider business gossip without violating community guidelines, tagging it with vague hashtags, number merger life, number upgrade, number new chapter. She didn't name Mark or the company, but she didn't have to. By the time Tessa's $385 hair appointment wrapped up, the post had 2,800 upvotes on a niche financial gossip subreddit known for digging into Dallas corporate drama. People were already speculating. Merger Mistress, one comment read. Another. Someone's about to violate HR clauses, lol. Tessa scrolled, delighted. She had no idea that the internet never truly forgets and that compliance teams pay for social listening reports just as eagerly as brands do. She began deleting older photos of herself with Mark ones taken months earlier, before he'd introduced her as anything more than his creative consultant. Chloe raised a brow, trying to look single before the announcement. Just cleaning up my grid, Tessa said breezily. Emily doesn't need breadcrumbs. She smirked as she hit delete, not realizing screenshots had already been captured in dozens of places, some automatically, by the very monitoring tools Chloe did freelance work for. Flashback Emily's living room, 2022. Emily stood in her warmly lit living room, arranging appetizers on a tray, smiling as Tessa walked in behind Mark. Tessa Monroe, 27, our intern, he'd said casually that day, introducing her with a grin that seemed a little too bright. She's brilliant with social media. Emily had shaken Tessa's hand, offering a glass of wine. Make yourself at home, she'd said. Tessa's smile had been just as bright as tonight's salon grin. Too bright. The kind people use when they're hiding something sharp behind their teeth. The memory dissolved somewhere across town, but the consequences were about to cross paths. Chloe checked her phone, which was buzzing nonstop. Girl, you're trending on that finance forum I told you about. People think you're about to be Dallas royalty. I am about to be Dallas royalty, Tessa said, crossing her legs. Once Mark's bonus hits, it's over for everyone who doubted us. Chloe glanced down at another notification, this one, a text from a regular corporate client contact she kept in her phone under a coded nickname, Blue Star Client. Blue Star Client wasn't a person. It was how Chloe labeled her most lucrative contract, a monthly retainer from an unnamed law firm to flag any viral gossip tied to major Dallas deals. The law firm paid well to stay ahead of problems. She opened the message. Can you send any clips tied to the Meridian rumor we discussed? Anonymous is fine. Chloe didn't think twice. She tapped the salon video, hit share, and forwarded it straight to the contact number, assuming it would go into a faceless system somewhere. What she didn't know was that the number routed to a monitored inbox at Wilcox and Arden, to a folder labeled Reputational Risk, E.D. Holdings. At 3:46 p.m., the clip of Tessa laughing about the practice wife pinged onto a screen in the same building where Emily had spent the morning authorizing a deeper audit. Nora opened it with a single raised brow and forwarded it into the Section 14C case file with one click. It was 2 business days after the audit began, a quiet Monday morning in downtown Dallas, when Emily stepped into the private executive boardroom of ED Holdings Group. The room was tucked behind a frosted glass corridor that most employees didn't even know existed, the kind of place used only for conversations too sensitive for ordinary conference walls. If you'd been there, you would have felt how different this air was from the night of the merger celebration. Still corporate, still sharp, but charged with something else entirely. Power. Hidden. Waiting. Finally stirring. A portrait dominated the far wall. Her father, Peter Clark, mid-laugh in a navy blazer, painted the year before he died. His eyes seemed to follow her across the room, a reminder of every warning he'd ever given her about men who saw value only in ownership, never in partnership. Harold King, 58, silver-haired CEO face of E.D. Holdings, whose cufflinks were always polished to the point of reflection, stood when she entered. Emily, he greeted gently, not with the empty politeness he used in public meetings, but with the familiarity of someone who had watched her grow up roaming these halls. At the head of the table sat Edward Sloan, 63, her father's former business partner and now chairman of the board, a man with a slow, deliberate way of speaking as if every word needed to earn its place. His beige sweater vest made him look almost scholarly, but his eyes were sharp enough to cut glass. "Emily," Sloan said, folding his hands, "it's time you reviewed the ownership summary. After everything that's happening with Meridian and with Mark, we can't delay clarity." She took the seat nearest the portrait, her fingers unconsciously reaching for the silver pendant at her throat. "Let's begin," Harold said, sliding a binder toward her. "You already know the basics, but we need to confirm everything formally in this context." Emily opened the binder. The first page carried a valuation. Inheritance assessment, $2,020 $128 million. Sloan cleared his throat. "When your father passed, he left you 71% controlling interest of ED Holdings. That stake has increased slightly due to various acquisitions handled through Northlake Crest LLC, the shell entity we set up for your privacy. Northlake Crest Capital is just the public-facing investment arm," Harold added. "Northlake Crest LLC is the private vehicle that actually holds your shares." Emily swallowed. She had known the number. She had signed documents. But something about hearing it, said aloud in this room with her marriage collapsing outside, it felt like stepping back into her own skin after years of being talked over, leaned on, diminished. 71%, she repeated quietly. "Correct," Sloan said. "The remaining shares are spread among us and a few institutional investors. But nothing outweighs your vote. Harbor Crest Trust holds your personal real estate. Northlake Crest holds your equity in E.D. Holdings. All of it insulated from marital property claims by design." Emily nodded. "I didn't want Mark to feel like he was marrying into something. I wanted us to be equals." Harold exchanged a look with Sloan, one that said they had both predicted this moment long ago. He tapped the second page of the binder. "The board bylaws require owner anonymity in some deals to prevent conflict. That's why Mark only saw Northlake Crest Capital in his documents. It's why he doesn't know. Why he never thought to check." Emily felt a tension rise in her chest, defensiveness, guilt, anger intertwined. "I thought if he didn't know, he wouldn't feel like he was being measured against it. I didn't want any of this to be about money." "You were equals," Sloan said softly. "He simply never recognized it." She closed the binder, steadying her breath. "So what does my authority allow me to do with the Meridian deal?" Harold took a seat across from her. "Everything related to risk. As majority owner, you can expand the scope of Section 14C, approve disciplinary recommendations, or, in extreme cases, halt or unwind certain executive arrangements. We won't touch the purchase price without legal necessity. It would damage our reputation with sellers, but leadership is another story." He opened a slim folder and moved it toward her. "Evan Marshall's preliminary audit report is in. Based on internal messages, expense misuse, and the social media clip Nora forwarded, Mark has already violated our interpersonal conduct and reputational risk clauses." Emily's muscles tightened, but not in fear. "In recognition," Harold continued, voice calm but firm, "compliance is recommending formal disciplinary proceedings. Possible outcomes include forfeiture of his $12 million signing bonus and removal from his executive contract at Northlake Crest." Shock flared inside her, but it no longer paralyzed her. It sharpened. The humiliation from the driveway still echoed in her ribs, but here in this room it turned into something firmer. A decision, forming in her bones. She reached for the folder. Her father's portrait watched over her shoulder. Flashback hospice room, Seattle, 2020. Her father lay propped against pillows, sunlight slanting across the blanket. His voice was thin, but his words were steady. He whispered, "don't let anyone use my empire to hurt you. That's why I built the protections. Not for wealth. For you." Emily clutched his hand. "Dad, Mark isn't like that. He loves me." His eyes softened with both love and sorrow. "People change when they taste power. Protect yourself." The memory dissolved. It was Monday morning in Dallas again, and the weight of her father's warning settled in her chest not as fear, but as resolve. Harold slid one last document across the table. A single line stood out in bold. Recommended next step, convene executive review panel. Dalton Mark potential outcomes. Written censure, bonus forfeiture, or termination. Her breath caught not in shock this time, but in the gravity of it. Her decision wouldn't just topple his fantasy, it would shape how her company responded to betrayal and abuse of power. She didn't reach for the pen, not yet. But she looked up at Harold and Sloane with a steadiness that hadn't been in her eyes 2 days ago. "Schedule the panel," she said, "and make sure the process is airtight. No shortcuts, no gray areas." Harold nodded, expression unreadable. "Of course, we'll treat this like any other executive. The calendar invite will go out as a routine review. He won't know what it really is." She rose slowly, the pendant warm against her skin. As she moved to leave the room, the folder slid a little on the polished table like it was being nudged toward her by invisible hands. By legacy, by betrayal, by truth. She didn't sign anything today, but the decision had already begun forming, quietly, unmistakably. And outside the boardroom, Mark had no idea the ground beneath him was already cracking. 4 days later, on a gray Friday morning in downtown Dallas, Emily stepped into the compliance operations suite, a floor most executives pretended didn't exist. The air was cool, humming with the low thrum of server racks, and the walls were lined with monitors displaying cascading spreadsheets, flagged emails, and digital trails most people never realized they left behind. If you'd been in that room, you would have felt it immediately. This wasn't where scandals were born. It was where they were dissected. Emily walked beside Nora Bennett, 44. Her attorney, whose sharp auburn hair and composed stride made her look like she belonged in places where truth cut deep. They entered a glass-walled war room where the compliance team had gathered analysts in crisp shirts, rolled-up sleeves, eyes fixed on screens. At the center stood Evan Marshall, 38, the corporate compliance officer she'd met days earlier, and beside him, Derek Cho, 41, a senior investigator with square glasses and a habit of tapping his pen when he was about to drop bad news. "Morning, Miss Clark," Derek said, nodding with the mix of respect and curiosity reserved for someone whose name appeared on ownership documents but rarely in hallways. Emily returned the nod and sank into the seat at the end of the long digital table, her fingers brushing the silver pendant she always wore. That small motion was the only sign of nerves she allowed herself. She was here as the majority owner, but she was also the wife who'd once believed in the man now under review. Evan tapped the center screen. "We've moved into phase 2 of the Section 14C review," he said. "And well, we found something significant." The words hung for a beat. Emily steadied herself. "Show me." The screen lit up with a transaction trail. Lines of ledger entries, timestamps, memo fields. Derek pointed to a flagged transfer, highlighted in red. 3 months ago, Mr. Dalton authorized a transfer of Meridian subsidiary stock from an internal allocation pool assets he had insider knowledge of to a newly registered marketing firm. A pop-up window displayed the receiving party, Monroe Creative Strategies, LLC registered owner, Tessa Monroe, Tessa's company. Nora leaned forward, voice low. "He transferred company-related value to his Mistress's LLC before closing the deal?" Derek nodded. "Valued at approximately $180,000 based on the closing price at the time. His internal memo justification reads, consulting partnership, but the timestamps line up with calendar entries labeled personal dinners. No invoices. No deliverables in our system." Emily felt something hot rise in her chest, anger, humiliation, but it didn't consume her. It hardened. She inhaled slowly and let the feeling settle into something sharper. "Is that enough to trigger penalties?" she asked. "Yes," Evan said. "Under 14C, undisclosed personal relationships combined with questionable transfers qualify as reputational and ethical risk. This alone gives us grounds to recommend clawbacks on his executive compensation." Derek tapped again. Another window opened this time, internal messages pulled from Mark's corporate email and chat accounts. At hiring, he'd signed the standard IT policy. Company devices could be audited. They'd blurred out irrelevant lines. What remained glowed, damning. The 29th of March, 2025, 11:12 p.m. "Once this deal hits, I'm milking every penny and ditching the old life. Tessa gets it. Emily won't." The words slammed into her like a blunt force. She thought she'd grown numb to his cruelty, but seeing the sentence stamped with date and time on company systems felt different. This wasn't suspicion. This was evidence. Nora's jaw tightened. That single message violates our reputation clause under 14C. Combined with the Monroe transfer, we're looking at serious internal sanctions and a probable regulatory referral. At minimum, he risks losing his $12 million signing bonus and his executive position at North Lake Crest. A junior analyst spoke up from the other side of the room, hesitant. There's more coming in. We're still indexing his mobile backups. His corporate phone was under our mobile device management, so his text logs and app messages are syncing now. Emily's fingers tightened around her pendant. She remembered, suddenly, another time, another warning she'd brushed off as love. She'd been chopping vegetables when Mark walked in laughing on the phone with a coworker. Prenups? He'd scoffed. Please. Only paranoid people need that. If you trust someone, you don't need paperwork. He'd kissed her cheek, smug and sure. She'd smiled, blindly reassured, never considering that no prenup also meant that if he ever torched his own career, there wouldn't be a neat way for him to wall his money off from consequences or from divorce. The memory dissolved, leaving behind a new clarity. No prenup meant no special protections for him. The sale money he'd bragged about was now headed straight into a divorce environment he no longer controlled. Nora folded her arms, studying Emily. We moved to disciplinary proceedings. HR is assembling an executive review panel. They want to schedule the hearing within a week. Emily felt the shift inside herself the moment humiliation finished transforming into purpose. Make sure the process is airtight, she said softly. Every step by the book. I don't want him to be able to claim witch hunt. We will, Evan replied. Your involvement as majority owner can remain confidential. You can watch from the observation room and cast your vote afterward, or you can choose to be in the open. Not yet, Emily said. Let him think he's just dealing with HR. On the wall, a new notification pinged, followed by a blinking banner. Hearing confirmation. Executive review panel scheduled. Dalton. Nora checked her phone, then looked at Emily with a knowing expression. It's set. The invite went out as routine post-merger review. He'll assume it's just onboarding. She paused, letting the words land. He has no idea you'll be on the other side of that glass. It was 1 week later in downtown Dallas, on the 42nd floor of the corporate headquarters, when Mark Dalton walked through the glass double doors of the executive hearing room, looking like a man about to receive an award rather than face an inquiry. The city stretched beneath him in sharp spring sunlight, and he strode across the polished floor with the swagger of someone who'd never once believed consequences applied to him. If you'd been standing in that hallway, you'd have seen the way employees stepped aside out of respect, intimidation, or the assumption that a man attached to a $40 million deal surely owned the room he walked into. They were wrong. Mark wore a deep burgundy suit that looked expensive but slightly too tight, as if he'd bulked up at the gym just to appear more commanding. The watch, his $22,000 trophy piece, flashed like a warning signal every time he adjusted his cuff. Tessa Monroe waited just off to the side of the reception area, pacing with the agitation of someone who thought she deserved a seat in the hearing but had been politely, firmly denied. It's nothing, Mark murmured to her as he passed. Routine review. HR crap. They do it with all acquired execs. He kissed her cheek, loud enough that the receptionist stiffened. After this, we'll celebrate. Maybe book that Napa trip. I've earned it. Tessa nodded, but her fingers twisted the strap of her handbag nerve she couldn't quite contain. A man about to be questioned about ethics rarely brought his mistress as emotional support, but Mark was convinced he was untouchable. Inside the executive hearing room, a long mahogany table dominated the center. At the far end sat Harold King, 58, immaculate as always, and beside him Linda Grayson, 51, the HR director whose posture was so straight it bordered on aggressive. On Harold's other side sat Evan from compliance and a company attorney. Along the left wall were tinted glass panels decorative to any outsider, but in reality, shielding a separate observation area from view. Behind those panels, silent and unseen, Emily sat with Nora at her side. Only a faint silhouette hinted at their presence. Mark didn't notice. Why would he? In his mind, Emily was on the way out of his life, not at the center of the company he'd just entered. Well, Mark said, sliding into the chair across from Linda with more confidence than the moment deserved. Let's get this over with. I've got another meeting at 11. Linda folded her hands. This may take longer than 20 minutes, Mr. Dalton. He forced a chuckle. Hey, I'm on your side. You all made a smart buy. Dalton Modular's going to make this portfolio look good. Harold's expression was unreadable. That's what we're here to ensure. The hearing began. For the first 15 minutes, the questions seemed harmless. Why certain travel line items were duplicated? Why consultant dinners involved the same name repeatedly? Why an external marketing firm, Monroe Creative Strategies, had been engaged without a formal contract? Mark breezed through them, leaning back in the chair, gesturing casually. Look, Monroe Creative is a boutique firm, very agile. We had an understanding. Not everything needs to be bogged down in paperwork. I was doing what was best for growth. Miss Monroe is not on any approved vendor list, Linda said evenly. Nor is there a conflict of interest disclosure naming her as someone with whom you have a personal relationship. Mark's smile thinned. You have no idea what my personal life looks like. Emily's probably feeding you half-truths and making herself the victim. Behind the glass, Nora's brow twitched. Emily stayed still. Linda tapped her tablet. This review is based on transaction logs, travel records, and internal communications, not your spouse's opinion, Mark shifted. Fine, then there's nothing to worry about. I delivered a $40 million deal. Harold looked at Evan. Let's move to the next phase. Evan dimmed the lights slightly and activated the wall display. On the glass, receipts appeared, hotel charges, duplicate flights, dinners for two, all coded as client development. The same names surfaced in note fields and guest lines. Tessa Monroe. You billed Miss Monroe's personal stays to the company, Linda said. She is neither an employee nor a disclosed vendor. Those were working trips, Mark snapped. Networking, brand positioning, strategy. She's basically been operating as our CMO. She deserves, but she is not your CMO, Linda cut in. She is your undisclosed partner. He bristled. You can't say that. You don't know what Emily is like behind closed. Linda didn't flinch. We're not here about your marriage. We're here because of what you charge to this company. He opened his mouth again, but Harold lifted a hand. Mark, there's more. A new screen loaded, internal chat logs, highlighted in yellow, and the 29th of March 2025, 11:12 p.m. Once this deal hits, I'm milking every penny and ditching the old life. Tessa gets it. Emily won't. Silence dropped like a stone. That was a joke, Mark said. Repeated jokes like this, combined with the financial pattern, constitute reputational risk, Evan said. Under Section 14C, we have an obligation to act. Mark scoffed. This is ridiculous. This has Emily's fingerprints all over it. She's spiteful. She's been undermining me for months because I outgrew her. Behind the glass, Emily's jaw tightened, but her expression stayed composed. She remembered her father's voice. When truth stands, he told her, you don't need to raise your voice. Linda glanced at Harold. Harold gave a barely there nod. Mr. Dalton, Linda said. We're now moving into phase 2 of this hearing. She tapped a control panel. With a soft mechanical click, the tinted glass partitions unlocked and began to slide open. Mark frowned, turning. The movement was slow enough to build suspense, fast enough to feel sudden. When the glass fully retracted, he froze. Emily sat behind it at a secondary table, posture straight, eyes calm, presence unmistakable. Nora sat beside her, legal pad in front of her, watching. It took a full 5 seconds for Mark's brain to catch up. You could practically see the realization crawl across his face, the collapse of assumptions, the dawning understanding that the woman he'd discarded and humiliated had been in a position he'd never even thought to ask about. You? He whispered. What are you doing here? Emily didn't answer. She didn't need to. Her silence was a scalpel. Harold cleared his throat. Mr. Dalton, I think it's time we discuss who you've actually been working for. The trap had sprung, and he was only beginning to understand how deep it went. The moment the glass partitions opened, revealing Emily seated with Nora, the temperature in the executive hearing room seemed to drop 10 degrees. It was still the same late Thursday morning in downtown Dallas, the sun glinting off neighboring skyscrapers, but inside, the air turned heavy. If you'd been there, you would have watched Mark's face drain of color, the swagger evaporating from his posture like heat from cooling metal. Most people assumed this was the part where Emily would unleash years of bottled-up anger in one explosive speech. They were wrong. She was precise. Harold reclaimed the room. Mr. Dalton, he said in that steady, neutral tone. Men with decades of corporate crisis learn to wear like a second skin. Phase 2 is about clarity. He gestured toward Emily. You know Emily as your wife. What you have not known is that Emily Clark is also the majority owner of ED Holdings Group LLC, the parent company of Northlake Crest Capital. The words landed like a gavel. Mark stared. That's not she can't. Nora slid a copy of the ownership summary across the table, stopping just short of his hand. She can, Nora said quietly, and she does. Screens along the wall refreshed, not with numbers yet, but with headlines. E. Holdings majority stake. Clark family estate internal governance. Owner anonymity protocol. Linda kept her tone clinical. Your behavior isn't just a marital issue, Mr. Dalton. It's a governance issue. And now the owner is here to hear it. Evan tapped his tablet. We'll move to the final evidence set. First came the hotel receipts. Henley, Crescent, a boutique in Austin, executive suites, weekends, weeknights, all billed under client development, all with Tessa's name as guest or second occupant. Next, the stock transfer. Meridian subsidiary shares. Internal pool. Transfer to Monroe Creative Strategies, LLC. Approximate value at date of transfer. $180,000. Undisclosed personal relationship, Evan said. Undocumented consulting scope. No deliverables on file. No conflict of interest form. All prior to deal closure. Mark's voice cracked. Those were legitimate consulting services. You don't know what Tessa did for our brand? Then you should have documented it, Linda replied, and disclosed the relationship. Then came the messages, the one Emily had read before, and more she hadn't seen. The 10th of February, 2025, 12:41 a.m. Once the old life is out of the way, we'll be the power couple, Tess. Boardrooms, beaches, everything. She'll be fine. She can take the house. I'll take the world. The 29th of March 2025, 11:12 p.m. Once this deal hits, I'm milking every penny and ditching the old life. Tessa gets it. Emily won't. Mark gritted his teeth. Those messages are private. You had no right. You signed an IT and device policy when we gave you a corporate phone and email, Evan said evenly. You acknowledged your communications could be audited for compliance. They were. Nora's voice was measured but cold. These behaviors create reputational risk for ED Holdings. They also expose us to potential regulator attention. Section 14C exists for exactly this reason. Based on this, Linda continued, HR and compliance are jointly recommending the following. Immediate forfeiture of your $12 million signing bonus. Removal from consideration for any profit sharing or partnership track at Northlake Crest. Termination of your executive employment agreement for cause. Mark lurched to his feet. You can't do this. Harold, come on. You know what I've delivered. I built the company you just bought. He stabbed a finger toward Emily, is using you for revenge. This is a personal vendetta dressed up as policy. Harold didn't blink. Emily doesn't manage HR or compliance. She doesn't control data. She controls her vote. The evidence came from our systems, not from your marriage. Emily finally spoke. Her voice was calm, level. You did this to yourself, Mark. He turned on her. Really? After everything I did for us? You were nothing when I met you. You were hiding behind charity events. I gave us momentum. The room went very, very still. Harold glanced at the panel, members seated along the sides, 2 board representatives, an outside ethics advisor. We have to move to the vote. There were 7 voting members in the room. Harold, the HR director, Evan for compliance, the external ethics advisor, 2 board representatives, and Emily, whose majority stake effectively weighted the outcome. Linda slid a document toward Emily, the line at the bottom labeled, Majority Owner, Disciplinary Vote. Emily's fingers brushed her pendant, thumb running over the faint engraving she knew was there. Lasting. Flashback Hospice Room 2020. Her father's fading voice. Never let betrayal make a home inside your life. End it the moment it crosses the threshold. Emily lifted the pen. She didn't make a speech. She didn't list the nights she'd stayed up doing his books, the investors she'd quietly steered his way, the humiliation on the driveway. She just signed. I vote for termination and forfeiture, she said. One by one, the others added their signatures. Unanimous. Linda stood. Mr. Dalton, your employment is terminated effective today at 4:12 p.m. Your building access will be revoked within the hour. You will receive a written notice of your forfeited compensation and any remaining severance provisions under standard policy. You think this is over? Mark shouted. You think you've beaten me? I'll sue. I'll go to the press. I'll take everything. Emily didn't move. You already tried to take everything, she said quietly. You just didn't read who it belonged to. Security appeared at the doorway, 2 officers in dark uniforms. One handed Mark a white envelope. This is a restricted access notice, the guard said. You're not permitted on floors 40 through 45 without written authorization. That includes your former office. Mark stared at Emily with the horror of someone who'd climbed a ladder only to discover it was leaning against the wrong wall. He stormed out, nearly knocking over a chair, still yelling as the doors closed behind him. Silence settled over the room, a deep, final kind of silence. Nora exhaled slowly. That's one piece done. Emily stared at the closed doors, her expression unreadable but steadier than it had been in weeks. Justice was no longer just theoretical. It had specific line items, timestamps, signatures, but she knew something Mark didn't. The house he was living in? He'd never bothered to read that paperwork either. It was Friday morning in Highland Park, the kind of bright, too clear morning that made expensive lawns sparkle and exposed every crack beneath the glossy surface. Mark Dalton woke to the sound of engines and voices outside his bedroom window. He pulled back the curtains and saw 2 moving trucks in the driveway and 3 uniformed movers carrying out boxes he thought belonged to him. If you'd been on that street, you would have seen the confusion flicker across his face, a man who had always assumed the world bent around his will, now watching it shift without his permission. He thundered downstairs in bare feet, shirt half buttoned. What the hell is going on? He shouted. Standing in the foyer was Marianne Holt, 52, the trust attorney for Harbor Crest Trust, her steel gray ponytail pulled tight, glasses perched low on her nose. She held a leather folder and a clipboard, the way someone holds a shield. Good morning, Mr. Dalton, she said, in a tone that suggested it was anything but, per instructions from the trustee of Harbor Crest Trust, and under a temporary occupancy order we obtained this morning. We're here to enforce a change in who's allowed to live on this property. Mark blinked. Occupancy? This is my house. Marianne opened the folder. The property at 117 Willow Bend was purchased in 2019 under Harbor Crest Trust. Sole beneficiary, Emily Clark. You were permitted to reside here as her spouse. That permission has now been revoked. Tessa stumbled into the entryway wearing one of Mark's shirts like a dress, mascara smudged, hair unbrushed. Mark, what is happening? She hissed. Make them stop. This is insane. It's marital property, Mark snapped, grasping for control. We'll let the divorce court figure out who gets what. You can't just throw me out. Marianne remained unbothered. Family law will sort out any marital equity later. But the trust controls legal title and immediate occupancy. We notified you via email and certified mail this morning. Movers have been arranged to pack personal property. You have 24 hours to vacate before we escalate to court filings. Tessa clutched his arm. Mark, do something. Before he could respond, sharp clicking noises came from the sidewalk camera shutters. 2 photographers stood behind a low hedge, long lenses trained on the doorway. Yesterday's corporate termination hadn't stayed private for long. A short item in a business blog had already turned into a local headline. Now they were catching the follow-up. Disgraced executive being removed from a house he always called my place. Seriously? Mark barked at them. Get off my property. It's trust property, Marianne said softly. Another thing you'd know if you read what you sign. Inside, movers work methodically, boxing books, cufflinks, suits, electronics, anything not nailed down or attached to the trust-owned structure. Items obviously belonging to Emily framed photos, her childhood piano were inventoried separately. The front door opened again. Emily walked in. She wore a simple cream blouse and black slacks. No entourage, no drama. The only hint of anything different was the way she carried herself grounded, unshaken. If you'd been watching her, you would have seen a woman who had walked through fire and come out done with burning. Tessa bristled. Oh, you have got to be kidding me. You came to gloat? Emily didn't look at her. She nodded once to Marianne. Thank you for coming in person. Marianne inclined her head. We'll stick to the inventory list we discussed. Anything ambiguous goes into storage until the divorce court decides division. Mark followed Emily up the stairs, anger breaking through his earlier shock. You can't just erase me from everything in 1 week. This is my home, too. Emily didn't stop. It was my father's money, she said calmly. Held in a trust for me. You knew that when we signed the mortgage paperwork. Or you would have, if you'd read it. In the primary bedroom, she went to the tall white dresser on the right, the one he'd once made a big deal about, buying together when they upgraded from Craigslist furniture. She opened the top drawer. Inside, beneath folded scarves and a small jewelry pouch, was a tiny velvet box, the original box for her silver pendant. She lifted it gently and opened it. Inside was a folded note, flashback hospice room, 2020. Her father's handwriting uneven from weakness, but still unmistakably his. Your strength is not loud. It is lasting. Emily had read it 100 times in the months after he died. She'd tucked it back into the box and told herself she'd never forget. Then life got busy. Mark's company needed her help. Grief settled into routine. Now, holding it again, she felt the words settle differently. She slipped the note into her pocket and closed the box. That was all she'd come for, a piece of her past reclaimed. She walked back downstairs. Mark trailed behind her, still half shouting, half pleading. Emily, come on. You've made your point. Just tell them to stop. We can work something out. Look at what you're doing to my reputation. To us. There is no us, Mark, she said quietly. You ended that in a boardroom. Tessa stepped forward, voice shrill. Emily, you can't do this. You're just bitter because he chose me. Emily finally met her eyes. I'm not doing this because he chose you. I'm doing this because he chose to lie, steal, and humiliate me using resources my family built. She turned to Marianne. Follow the plan. If he refuses to leave after 24 hours, call me. We'll let the court document his refusal. Then she walked to the door. Mark grabbed for her wrist, but she stepped back before he touched her. Don't, she said. Not again. The authority in her tone was new. Even he heard it. Emily, please, he said, and for the first time his voice cracked not with rage but with fear. I just need time to fix this. You had time, she said. Years of it. She stepped outside. The door closed behind her, leaving Mark standing in the foyer as movers carried out the last visible pieces of the life he thought he built. His phone buzzed. He snatched it up, desperate for some good news. The preview line on the screen read, Subject, SEC, Preliminary Inquiry Notification, Informal. From, you, Securities and Exchange Commission, Enforcement. His lungs tightened. He opened it. The email was careful, bureaucratic, an informal notice that recent transactions involving Monroe Creative Strategies and Dalton Modular Systems were under preliminary review. They requested preservation of records. His lawyers would receive follow-up. Mark looked around at the boxes, at Tessa's frantic pacing, at the empty spaces where his things had been. For the first time, he truly understood. Emily hadn't just taken everything. She'd simply stopped letting him take what was never his. 3 months later, on a warm July morning in downtown Dallas, the city's financial district shimmered under the sun as shareholders poured into E. Holdings headquarters for the quarterly meeting. Inside the glass-paneled auditorium, the mood buzzed with anticipation not of crisis, but of progress. If you'd been in that room, you would have noticed something subtle yet unmistakable. The quiet confidence that filled the space now that the company had shed the chaos of scandal and tightened its ethics. Most people there thought they understood who was leading them into this new era. This time, they were right. At the center podium stood Emily Clark, 33, majority owner of E.D. Holdings, the woman who'd spent years avoiding the spotlight and now stepped into it only because it served the company, not her ego. She wore a tailored charcoal dress, understated but powerful. Around her neck hung the familiar silver pendant, polished, steady, symbolic of everything she had survived and rebuilt. Nora stood off to the side with a proud, restrained smile. Harold and Sloan occupied the front row, flanked by board members and institutional investors. Emily clicked the first slide. Quarterly profit, $11.7 million, she announced. A ripple of satisfaction swept the room. Fingers typed, cameras flashed. Increasing transparency, restructuring compensation models, And removing unresolved conflicts of interest has allowed us to stabilize quickly after the Meridian acquisition, she continued. Our ethics reforms have not hurt performance. They've improved it. Behind her screens transitioned to headlines from major financial outlets. Ethics reforms boost ED. Holdings performance Dalton scandal. Spurs governance overhaul. Northlake Crest tightens executive conduct rules. Another set of headlines scrolled in a smaller corner. Former XEC hits regulatory headwinds after insider transfer sources. Dallas entrepreneur under SEC scrutiny. Mark's name wasn't in the big font anymore. He wasn't the story, just a cautionary example in the footnotes. Industry rumors said he'd burned through lawyers' retainers, fighting the termination, and now rented a small furnished apartment outside the city limits, bouncing between calls with regulators and attempts to pitch new ventures no serious investor wanted to touch. He wasn't literally sleeping on the streets. But for a man who'd measured himself by offices and views, his new reality was a different kind of homelessness. Tessa Monroe had gone nearly silent online. After paparazzi photos of her screaming on the Highland Park driveway made their way to gossip sites, sponsorship inquiries dried up. Within weeks, she'd rebranded her accounts as taking a break to reset and reportedly moved to another city to start fresh. Emily's life, meanwhile, wasn't loud now. It didn't need to be. The Highland Park house was hers again, not just on paper, but in feeling. She'd repainted walls, changed furniture, and removed every piece that reminded her of arguments and late-night phone calls he'd taken on the patio. The piano stayed, the pendant stayed, the note from her father stayed, framed in a drawer she opened when she needed to. With trust, dividends, and board approval, she launched a new philanthropic initiative through ED, Holdings, the lasting foundation, grants and scholarships for women, leaving financially controlling relationships or rebuilding careers after divorce. $2 million in seed funding. Applications had flooded in within days, stories of women who'd left behind, controlling spouses, closed bank accounts, careers they'd been told they weren't allowed to pursue. If you'd seen her reading those applications at her kitchen table late at night, you wouldn't have seen a vengeful ex-wife. You'd have seen a woman turning her own story into structural help for others. Back in the auditorium, Emily clicked the final slide of the presentation. "Thank you all for your trust," she said, "and for believing in the future we're building not just in profit, but in how we earn it." The room erupted in applause. Cameras captured her smile, a quiet, genuine curve that carried relief, pride, and a new vision. As the shareholders stood to mingle and discuss numbers, Harold approached her, tablet in hand. "Emily," he murmured, "a new acquisition target just came in, valued at $55 million. Clean records, innovative team. I think you'll want to review it before tomorrow's strategy session." She took the tablet, scanning the summary. Another opportunity, another deal, another future to shape, this time with clear eyes and firm boundaries. The auditorium lights glinted off her pendant as she turned toward the boardroom, her boardroom now, her father's legacy fully in her hands, no longer as someone's plus one, not as a placeholder, not as background. As she walked through the glass doors, the camera would linger on her silhouette, every step calm and certain. Somewhere across the city, in a smaller, cheaper apartment, Mark Dalton scrolled past one of those headlines about ED Holdings' record quarter. He didn't click it. He didn't have to. He already knew the truth that had taken him too long to see. Emily didn't just survive him. She surpassed him. I hope you enjoyed watching it as much as I enjoyed creating it. Like, share, and comment on the lessons you've learned. Let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. See you in my next video.